As you can see, there is a This Girl Can picture by sheer chance on my first slide. And as Lee said, the new strategy, I think, is challenging us and you and the whole system in ways that we couldn't have imagined. It was great fun to write the Sport England strategy, and we were set a fantastic challenge by DCMS in their strategy. Implementing it, though, is a lot harder and actually a lot more interesting, because there are lots of layers of things that we need to think about. And what I want to do in this presentation to you today is just to start to talk about some of the things that are developing as we think about how it will be implemented locally. So the title up there about expertise in the right places is very much about thinking what we need to put in place from a local perspective to make sure we can land the level of change that we need. And that level of change is really quite considerable. So it is the strategy that is dictating the need for change, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the standing back we've done to think about local delivery. One of the things my team are constantly saying to me is that, Jenny, you need really to drop the local from delivery, because all delivery happens in a place. So this is about how we make delivery happen. I am then going to go on to talk very specifically about the role of CSPs in that delivery and the next steps. What I'm not going to be able to do today is to give you complete certainty. And there's a good reason for that. It's because I don't quite know yet, and Sport England doesn't quite know yet. And also this is something that we need to develop in conjunction with you and other specialists who think hard about these things. So these ideas are developing in real time. We will share with you as much as we possibly can, and I'll try and give you a clear direction of travel today and a sense of the timetable and when we might get that certainty. So hopefully that will be helpful, and then CEOs and chairs do get a chance to cross-examine me over lunch later. So if it's begging lots of questions for you, very happy to start sharing everything that we know. But just stepping back for a moment and reminding ourselves why we need to change. I can't remember a government announcement, certainly not in this sector, that was met with the same degree of unalloyed, massive support as the government's new strategy. It really was incredibly strong, and from all parts of the sector. And when Sport England published its strategy, there was a similarly really strong, yes, this is the way that we need to go. But it is very, very different from what we have been doing and what you have been doing for a long period of time. So there's a lot of change here that means we need to think and work in a different way. And it's also genuinely difficult. So this is not a strategy about incremental change, and it's not about a strategy about working with partners we know really well on well-worn grooves. It is about making transformational change for the people who need it most and for the people for whom it will make the most difference. And I would say when we consulted on our strategy, the thing that came across most strongly was we really want you to think about how you work in a more integrated and holistic way locally. And so that's the way we're trying to develop our thinking, and you'll see that theme coming through very strongly. And as you know, one of the recommendations in the government strategy was to have an appraisal of CSPs, which came out with a really strong message that said CSPs need to exist. The network that you provide across the country is incredibly important, but it does need to change, it does need to move on. And in particular, we need to harness it in a way that will really facilitate the delivery of those overarching outcomes in the strategy. The things we can all cluster around about physical well-being, mental well-being, community and social well-being, individual development and economic development. So we know that there is a big prize there if we can get at it. What we need to do is to find a way where we work with you to combine national and local effort really effectively to get to those outcomes. So what I want to do is just to reflect a bit on what we've learned about local delivery and how we are thinking about it going forward, because we're not starting from a blank sheet here. There are messages, there's insight, and there are lessons that we can use. But we have to start from here, which is the size of the challenge. So this captures the figures produced by the First Active Lives survey, and in many ways, for those of us who work in sport, this is pretty familiar stuff, that a quarter of the population are inactive. Around 60% are active, and that's partly because we changed the breadth of what we measure to really look at all physical activity, including walking. And then there's that group in the middle who are doing something but aren't doing enough to get the optimum health benefits. The biggest challenge we have is the people who sit in that 25.6%. And it's tempting to think that that's not very big, but it's a quarter, it's a whole quarter of the 16 plus population who aren't managing 30 minutes a week at the moment at moderate intensity. And the challenge that that presents masks in a way the massive inequalities that sit in that one quarter. So the figure that probably worries me most when I look at all of the statistics is that just 17% of people in the highest socioeconomic groups are currently inactive. But when you go to the lowest, it's 40%. So there's some really huge inequalities there that at the moment our system isn't tackling. And I think one of the biggest things we need to remember when we look at these figures is that they're not acceptable, that they need to change. And therefore, if any of us is saying or thinking, we fix it already, we do it already, then we're not doing enough, because the impact is not sufficient to move those figures. So we may be doing some great things, we may be doing some really positive things, we might have wonderful ideas, but at the moment, this system that we are all part of is not moving that dial enough, and in particular, it's not moving it enough for the people who need it most. And we know that inactivity is really complex. And we know that the behaviour is really deeply entrenched because we as human beings are programmed for efficiency. We're programmed to do things really easily, to get to places in a really straightforward way. So we didn't do what Mika did to get here. We got in our cars or we got on a train, or probably very few of us took more than a few steps to actually get here because we got here in a really efficient and fast way. And as one of our behavioural specialists said to me the other day, what you need to remember, Jenny, is we've spent about 100 years designing activity out of our lives, designing the need to walk or ride or run so that we make it straightforward. So it's not going to take 5 minutes to design it back in again. And that is a really interesting, I think, message. And particularly when you think we have to do it at population level. So no other nation has managed this at population level. People have done it in parts, they've done it in bits of population, but nobody's done it particularly through tackling the inequalities. So if you go to people who are closest, it's a little bit easier. But if you look at the inequalities and you look at some of the stubborn groups, that's when it gets really difficult. And I think the thing we have learned from our local working and our project working so far is that incremental change doesn't cut it. So I can point you to lots of great projects Sport England has funded, which some of you have been involved in, where we've worked with maybe 100 or 200 or maybe 1,000 people, and a proportion of them have been inactive, and we've shifted them into inactive, have been inactive, and we've shifted them into activity, which is great for those individuals, but that's nowhere near population-wide change. So we have to find a way to move on with that, and in particular, we need a whole system approach. Now, some of you will have been to the local workshops that we've done lately, and I would say that in those workshops, this has been the moment when lots of people have started to think differently. So when we think what we mean by a whole system approach, this is how it builds up. Our emphasis on insight has got us all thinking about the individual. And I'm definitely guilty of that because I find the individual bit really straightforward. So when we think about what motivates an individual, their capabilities, their opportunities, their knowledge, their needs and their behaviours, we can design something that we think is going to be really appropriate for them. And in a sense, that's what this Girl Can does. It thinks about the individual issues about judgment and it tackles those. But actually, if we're going to change the whole system, there's several other layers that we need to deal with. We need to deal, for example, with the social environment, and this girl can edges towards that, because none of us exist in a vacuum. We exist with a family, with social groupings, with lots of people whose opinions affect what we do and what we choose not to do. So we have to impact on those social networks and those relations as well. And then whether we like it or not, we all come into contact with organisations and institutions. So what our employer wants us to do and makes it easy for us to do, what healthcare might prompt us to do, what a school might prompt us to do, all of those things play their part as well. And then there's the obvious physical environment. So the fact that it is difficult to get from, as I did, Reigate to here without doing any walking. That actually the environments we're in don't promote activity very easily. And then finally there's the policy environment. So that sense that there are laws, regulations, grants, systems that either make things easy or make things difficult. And if we're going to change the choices people make, we have to impact on every one of those steps, not just the individual one, and not just the great big policy environment either. So if we think how that might work then for a particular area, and I've just taken active ageing, which is one of the things we're working on at the moment within activity. Obviously at the individual level, we can begin to use the insight to work out what we might do. So we think about the physical capability, some of the mental barriers. This is something I used to do, not something I do now. I used to be brilliant at it, now I'm not. Sports about playing football, it's not about walking or swimming, some of the things I might choose to do now. And we can all speculate and manage at that level quite easily. But you need to build up the layers, because there will then be the issue about the social environment. So what kind of social support do I need? Do I need somebody to go with, for example? Do I need somebody to help me over that first entry point? Is my barrier about the fact I do most things on my own and I want to do things with other people, and therefore if you offer me a chance to socialise, then regardless of whether it's fitness or knitting or cooking, I'll be there because that's the thing I'm most interested in. There's then all the organisational stuff that sits around that. So lots of older people, as I can verify, spend rather more time with their GPs than they might previously have done. So there will be prompts in the system there that can really help move people along. And then they need to feel safe and that the environments are accessible. So having decent walking paths, having safe places where you can ride a bike off the road, having a loo when you need it, not having one 10 miles away, all those sorts of things are really important. And then finally there might be some policy prompts that you put in place. For example, free or discounted transport to get to a place where activity is happening. So you can see that when you take that whole system approach, you start to layer lots of things on top of each other, and a lot of what you need to make that change can be delivered by really good partnership working in the local environment, with the council, with the local infrastructure, with the local groups. And that's why that whole system approach is important. So skipping through what we've already learned from some of the place-based piloting we've done so far. The first is a big hairy target doesn't work. Telling people that we want 100,000 more people doing something in a place leads to incremental thinking. People add it up 10,000 at a time and you get a collection of projects, you don't get a changed outcome. So you'll see in our local delivery pilots we're not doing that. The size of place is not necessarily dictated by its geography or by its civic boundaries. People know what their place is, they know what their locality is, they decide what that place is. And if we're going to work in places, we need to be sensitive to those natural boundaries. And not everything in partnership starts with a local authority leading it. All of our recent experience says you need a really strong strategic partner with a good consortium of local leaders, but you can be completely neutral about who that strategic partner might be. And for us, it's really important we set a direction of travel, so what we're trying to achieve and what the justification is, but we need to collaborate on how it's done and evaluate really closely, learning not just what has worked, but what pieces of process have been in place to encourage that collaboration. And then behaviour change is slow. It is really difficult, so inevitably it will be slow, but there are things you can do to speed it up. like abandon the stuff that's not working, for example. Evaluate really hard as you go, or maybe take shortcuts in the insight. You don't necessarily need to start from scratch to know what some of the psychological barriers women will experience, for example. You don't need a piece of research on that. It's there, we can give it to you, and you can move on to the next phase. And in the pilots, we've learnt a lot more than that. When we have just gone round in workshops over the last 2 months talking to people about what our local pilots should look like. We've talked to over 700 people representing over 300 organisations in the last couple of months. And this just summarises some of the learning. So people really like and get that whole system approach. That's really been one of the big moments when the conversation has changed. The second thing is that it's really easy to deal with inequalities at a fairly surface level, and I've definitely been guilty of this at different times. So one of our biggest challenges now is about lower socioeconomic groups. And it's really easy when you're thinking about lower socioeconomic groups, because it does what it says in the tin. It's about your level of income dictated by your profession or your work or lack of it, is to start with the money. But actually, the money is often not the barrier. So it's very easy to say, we need some free provision, or all we need is some free transport, when probably you need something completely different. And it may well be that you need some free or some low-cost provision, but that is only relevant if people think this thing might be for them, and that they might be interested in it, and that they might get something out of it. And, for some of them, that they might even be able to cope with the thought of it. So there's some really transformational thinking coming out now, for example, about the lowest socioeconomic groups that says when you're having a tough time, the sheer mental effort and number of processes involved in holding down your job, feeding your children, paying your rent, making sure that you don't run out of money at the end of the month is so great that your bandwidth is taken up by all of that. It's a little bit like when you're sick, and it's a huge physical effort to do everything, so you don't have lots of thinking and relaxing and choosing time, because everything you're having to do is taken up by that. And that is what it is like when you're having a really tough time financially. So, the fact there might be a free session on at the swimming pool is not going to come anywhere near you when you've got those bandwidth challenges. So the way we think about how we present those opportunities, where they are, how easy they are to access, needs to be done in a really transformative way. And then this third one about a small number of authentic and impactful partnerships. This was written for me by somebody who went to the local workshops, and I said, what on earth does that mean? And they gave me a great example. So I would say Leeds was the pilot, was the workshop where people came back buzzing most and said we had the most extraordinary conversations. And one of the reasons they had extraordinary conversations is because they had a group of people who were not our usual suspects at all from Redcar. And these included somebody from the local authority, but it also included somebody from the local facilities operator and a local anaesthetist, who was there partly because he was from healthcare, but partly because he was a kind of local activator with really strong views and was sick of the fact that nothing was happening in our particular policy space. And he said things like, every time we have a conversation, we find something that's really brilliant to do, and then everybody looks at everybody else and says, well, I've got no money, so you're going to have to pay for it. And actually, when we start with what we have to do, inevitably that's going to be the case. And what the team said is the way that group of people talked about the real life experiences of the people that they might work with, that the outcomes they might really get for them, and in Redcar a lot of that is about mental well-being and also about tackling worklessness, that it was as if the people that they were seeking to work with were in the room. And that hardly ever happens. So there's something about getting the people together who can make us feel as if the people we're working with are in the room with us and are shaping what we want to do. And that leads to the final conclusion, is that lots of people would really like to do this, but it's hard, and we might not have the right skills, all of them, at the moment. So, where does that take us, and what does that mean in terms of CSPs? So So the first thing I need to say is there is no question but that the network of CSPs across the country is really needed. It absolutely is, and it has a very important role to play. And if we did not have a structure that was able to reach into all of the areas of England, then we would need to create it. And we do need that local delivery, but we need it to focus really sharply on tackling inactivity and growing the number of people who are active at that magic 150 minutes through underrepresented groups. So supporting core market is okay, but it's not the highest priority. Getting people who are doing something to do more is okay, but it's not the highest priority. Now, we're going to talk over lunch about funding and certainty, and I know that we've said we will cover your funding up to September 2017. It's going to take us a while to work out these new arrangements, so we need to extend it longer so you've got sufficient certainty to hold the skills that you've got and to plan for a potential new way of working. And I suppose the question for us really is whether we would just like to make our current model a bit better, where we stand back and performance manage you, or whether we can do and create a genuine change in the relationship. And we started to talk to you through a series of workshops which Ed and Mike from Sport England have been leading, and we are getting the sense that a transformational change in that relationship might be possible. And I guess what would denote that transformational change would be if there was far more genuinely seamless working between CSPs and Sport England. If there were people in your organisations who could go into local authorities, other local partners, and advocate for Sport England priorities, programmes, investment, and indeed reflect back to us the way that national programmes and thinking needed to change. Now, we do a tiny bit of that now. We need to do this much. And that would look and feel very, very different. And there's a lot of thinking to do, including with our board and our decision-making structures. But what it could look like is taking the relationship from here, which is essentially a linear one and a three-party one, with Sport England as the funding and the setter of demands, you as the interlocutor locally, and then the local delivery system, to one that looks rather more like this, where you and we are completely aligned, even overlapping in some areas, and that together we are helping the local delivery system, the system for delivering all those outcomes we want to make happen in your area, and where it is a two-way relationship. So it's not just us saying, we think Sportivate's great, please go and deliver that for us. It is you saying, this type of problem exists in my area, we think it probably exists in some more areas, and when you do X, it lands like this, whereas if you did it like that, it would make a big difference. So it would be a much stronger, more calibrated and nuanced two-way relationship, where you felt a much closer identity with us and we felt a much closer identity with you. So what would that actually involve? Well, you would need to know absolutely everything about your place and the population within it, not just through the lens of sport. In fact, the sport bit is kind of a given, and the hard bit is everything else. So you would know, in terms of ageing, for example, exactly where your biggest issues were in your patch, the people who were thinking most creatively, the people who had tried stuff and it hadn't worked, the people who had done stuff within activity and had learnt something, and the people who have never ever been anywhere near anything called activity and sport. So a really granular understanding of the local environment. And then a really strong sense that your role is not a doing role, it is a brokering and a facilitating role, so that you can spot actually that group of relationships, that group of partners should really be speaking to each other, and you become the thing that can help make that happen. And when we are doing something like a local pilot or want to make an investment in a range of areas like we do on Inactivity, you're actually the person who can go in locally and say, Sport England are doing something interesting here, or indeed there might be investment from another source, and you become the person and the people who promote that. And obviously you work with your local authority, but very much by consent. So alongside their strategy, filling in any gaps in their strategy, but not trying to control it, and not trying to supervene it in any way. Now, I know lots of you will have seen that slide from the workshops that Mike Diaper and Ed Sandham have been running, but it is quite a different role to what you do now, because if you go back to my starting point, that our current position is not an acceptable position. We all have to behave differently. You will recognise features of what I'm describing, but it's not adding up to a different kind of relationship. So that's where we would like to try and get it to. So it was genuinely seamless between us. So it really felt like we were aligned, so that we weren't standing back, just asking you to perform a particular function, but we were really working together, and you can reflect back to us in a much more internal, protected and positive environment, as well as us having that relationship with you. So, if we're going to do that, how might we go about it? Well, we need to develop it further, and we're having more detailed conversations with a number of you already, and we need to talk to our board, we need to talk more to DCMS and others about it. The local delivery pilots will be a really important step and will probably be the proving ground for some of this new type of relationship, and we should be selecting those in the autumn as far as the first 3 or 4 are concerned. We're reviewing at the moment our whole pattern of local delivery. So this isn't being done in isolation. A different relationship with CSPs is very much a key plank of how we might think and work locally, and how we might deploy our other local resources, including our own local staff. What we will do is to prepare a much more worked up proposal for you to look at in the next couple of months, and that should be done by May for you to feed into, with a view for us to have a plan to go to our board in June and to begin testing and piloting it later this year, with a rollout really over a year to 18 months and maybe a bit longer than that. Because in order to get away from the we're doing this now and this is just a tweak, we need to model what it looks like, so that you can see 2 or 3 organisations who are really working in this way, thinking in this way, and then say, okay, how different is that to how I feel now, to what I'm doing now? Also, we will almost certainly get it wrong the first couple of times and have to change and refine it as we go. So it would be mad to do it with a system of 44. We need to get 2, 3, 4 willing partners to start with, to pilot, to learn, and then see how it moves on. So, how would that make me feel if I was sitting out there? Probably slightly confused, probably slightly sceptical. Is it really different? Isn't this just more of the same? What I can absolutely promise you is that for the people who move to work in this way, it will not be more of the same. It will feel fundamentally different. And if you think about some of the toughest partnerships you've built, when you've had those moments of banging your head against a wall thinking, why am I doing this? That's what it's going to feel like. So it will be really different. I think thinking about whether you would be up for that would be my question number 1. Secondly, about the breadth of your system knowledge in your local area. So some of you will feel really comfortable outside the sport and activity sector. Some may feel less comfortable or have only penetrated certain parts of that non-sport system. So I'd be definitely thinking about that. And thinking about the relationships. So do I have relationships where maybe I've worked in this way? Or do I have experience where it's felt like a genuine multi-layered partnership that's got more equality in it, but where I have more responsibility too? And if that is the case, I'd be thinking about whether you want to be one of the first organisations to try and do this with us, provided we can come up with a workable model. So no certainty, for which I apologise, but lots of change. Really well thought through, progressive, piloted, but it will be different. because that 26% of people who are inactive, they need something to make a big difference for them. And that means we have to work in a fundamentally different way going forward. Thank you very much.